in the darkness. And I think our choice of speaker really will capture that for us, of how memorials and museums and the commitment to remember in an educational context does create light in darkness. I have many questions for Danny, not least what has happened just the last couple of weeks and how the Holocaust Museum has played that out. And indeed, a Confederate flag was found there. I think I'm right, but I'm going to let you speak to that. But what I really want to do, first of all, is to welcome a very honored guest. So Professor Danny Green is president and librarian at the Newberry Library in Chicago, adjunct professor of history at Northwestern. In 2018, at the Holocaust Museum, he curated Americans and the Holocaust to commemorate its 25th anniversary. Danny was appointed a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians in 2015. He serves on the nominating committee of the American Historical Association, also the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society, and on the board of directors for the Center of the New Deal Studies at Roosevelt University. I should also tell you that he was awarded a Saul Wiener Prize for Best Book in American Jewish History over a 2-year period, I presume, for the Jewish origins of cultural pluralism. We're really honored to have you. And not least, he is brother of our own Richard Green. So, and I can see your parents are here too. So by that standard, you are really one of us, and it feels a most familial evening for us to welcome you. I invited Danny because of Danny's association with Washington's, I forget the acronym, but you'll tell me, the Holocaust Memorial Museum of Washington. Yeah, I think so.
USHMM, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I remember going in its early 6 months, 1993, I think it was inaugurated, and I remember being there. It's very close to all the Smithsonian museums, but it is independent. And for me this year, thinking about the world as it was, and remember when I asked Danny whether he might join us, we did not know what would happen during the month of January 2021. I was really interested to see how the Holocaust Museum in Washington was affected by the need to memorialize other tragedies across the world, particularly in the United States, actually, and I think Danny will speak to that. So Danny, we are so delighted to have you this evening our time. It's a bit earlier for you, and the way Danny and I have planned this evening, Danny will speak first, and then we will have an opportunity to engage with him, questions through me asking him questions or enabling you, we'll see. Just a reminder, obviously, that the Jewish question, it is a question, not a statement, unless your statement is super short, but we really value his time for us to finish together at 8 to light a candle together. So over to you, Danny. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, so very much. It's good to be here. I was, of course, with you for Mavanwi's bat mitzvah and Ruben's bar mitzvah. I would have loved to be with you today, but this is one of the benefits of Zoom, is that we can be together this way for this hour. So thanks very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I want to tell you a little bit about the work that I did for the Holocaust Museum, specifically on the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition. But then I want to think more broadly about memorial culture around the world. I, of course, know more about the United States in this context, and I'm really curious to hear about your experiences there in terms of memorial culture, and perhaps we can talk about comparisons and contrasts across nations during the question and answer session. As Rebecca said, it is International Holocaust Remembrance Day today, and it's actually in the United States and Israel commemorated on a different day, on Yom HaShoah in April, to mark the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, rather than to mark the anniversary of the Soviet troops' encounter with the Auschwitz camp. And that in itself is a story that we could discuss, or a topic we could discuss, about the discrepancy in commemorative days across different nations, and how that relationship developed in response to, especially to the Cold War. The United States did not want to mark a day of Soviet troops encounter of the Auschwitz camp as much as they wanted to mark a day with activism or uprising among Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. So perhaps something we can discuss towards the end. As Rebecca said, I've had a long affiliation with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, even though I'm not currently on the staff. My affiliation there goes back over 20 years to an internship back in 1994 when the museum was just a year old at that point. In 2014, the museum started to think about its own 25th anniversary. 2018 was the 25th anniversary of the Holocaust Museum's opening on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and they asked me to curate an exhibition on Americans' response to the Holocaust. I started this work in 2014 and worked on the project for 5 years with a large team of researchers and exhibition designers and digital experience designers, everything that you would expect in a museum of that size. And we've produced now a gallery exhibition, an online exhibition that is very easily discoverable. It's called Americans and the Holocaust, that you can look at. And then we've, of course, produced educational guides and a very interesting crowdsourced website that looks at American press coverage of Nazism during the 1930s and 40s. There's a misapprehension or a misunderstanding that the story of the rise of Nazism and the persecution of Jews was somehow not well covered by the press across the United States. And in fact, the opposite is true. And I'll talk about why I think that makes this American inaction in response to Nazism even more difficult, a more difficult question to ask. We cannot say, as some have tried to say, well, the international community didn't really know what was happening, and so there was there was an action in response to that. In fact, the more difficult question is to realize how much information was available to the international community, and then to ask, so why wasn't more action taken to aid Jews or to rescue Jews under the threat of Nazism? The museum in Washington, D.C. gave me a very tall order in 2014. They said, we want to do an exhibition on Americans and the Holocaust, and tell us something new. That was about the extent of it. It was a major departure for that museum. Everything that they had done in the past, every major exhibition they had done in the past, had focused on victims or on perpetrators. And I think that is quite common at Holocaust museums, to focus on victims and perpetrators. This was the museum, I think, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., feeling that it had come to its own moment of maturity, turning 25 years old, and saying, we need to flip the mirror and turn the lens around and look at what Americans knew and what they did or what they didn't do. So that was the mandate, was to explore Americans' role in this history. And the museum, even though it had been in the founding charter of the museum, the founding charter of the museum dates back to 1979. It was something that was approved here by President Jimmy Carter in 1979, and it took 14 years to plan and open the museum by 1993. That founding charter says that this should be a memorial that looks closely at Americans' role in response to Nazism, but it hadn't lived up to that part of the charter until 2018. I should say also that the Holocaust Museum in Washington, for those who haven't been there, has a very particular approach to history that that really resonates with me. They don't try to present history in a neat package with handing you something with a bow on it as a gift and saying, here's what you should think. They want to raise difficult questions about history. They want people to be troubled. They want debates to go on in the galleries. If you turn to your spouse or your child or your friend or your parent in the gallery and you start debating something about what you've seen, that's a good outcome. for that museum. So they're trying to promote conversation. When the founding chair person of the museum was Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor. And when he spoke on opening day at the museum in April of 1993, he said, "This museum is not an answer, it's a question mark." And I like that approach to history, and I like that approach to museums. So what I was trying to do in this project then was to challenge some of the myths and misconceptions that the public has about Americans' response to Nazism. We asked questions that are seemingly simple, but really tried to open a lens to allow for broader conversations. We questions like, what did Americans know and when did they know it? And then a more difficult question, why wasn't the response in the United States more robust during the 1930s and 40s? The simple answer to what did Americans know and what did the international community know is a lot. We knew a lot. And for, especially for students of high school and college age coming through, which is a main audience for this exhibition and the museum, that was an important learning for them. I do think that meant we actually at the beginning of the project surveyed thousands of high school students to ask them, high school students across the United States, we asked questions like, do you think Americans had access to information about the persecution of Jews as it was happening? And the majority said no. So that was one of the myths and misconceptions that we had to overturn. And then we could ask that much more difficult question that I've already talked about. If we had access to this information, then why didn't rescue of Jews become a priority? And we want people to leave troubled with that because it will both, it will affect their understanding of the past, but we also hope that it may influence the way they act as citizens today when they see injustices that are going on. It is an answerable question of why didn't rescue of Jews become a priority? And what the exhibition does is here we really borrowed a framework from a fantastic scholar and now someone who was just nominated again to the Biden administration, a scholar named Samantha Power, who wrote a book called A Problem from Hell: America in the Age of Genocides. And what she argues in that book is that the United States response to international crises is shaped by domestic conditions. And I think that's often true when you look throughout United States history. So those domestic conditions in the 1930s and 40s in the United States were deep racism. We're living in a Jim Crow America, a segregated America. The height of anti-Semitism, arguably, throughout the 20th century in the United States is in the 1930s and 40s, here at home in the United States. Heightened xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment. Our United States Congress is passing numerous laws to limit immigration during the 1920s that are still going to be on the books when Hitler rises to power in 1933. There are deep national security concerns in the United States about immigrants and refugees. And then we have one of the worst economic crises in the United States. It comes on in 1929 with the Great Depression, and that lasts until the United States enters the war in 1941. So one of the reason this is when we talk about domestic conditions shaping our response to international concerns, there's really a perfect storm here at home in the United States of economic insecurity, national security concerns, racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia on the ground already by the time Hitler rises to power in 1933. And that all of those conditions affect our response. And those are the stories that get played out throughout the exhibition gallery. We tried to then, the last thing I'll say about this exhibition is we tried to frame some difficult questions about this history that would be resonant for people today, even though the exhibition, as you walk through the exhibition, you begin in 1918 at the end of World War I, and the exhibition ends in 1945. We weren't trying to comment too directly on the present because visitors bring the present with them into the galleries. But those questions that we asked, I think will be resonant for you today when you hear me say them. Questions like, how did Americans understand a democracy crumbling abroad? And how did they debate their responsibility to do something about it? How did the American people and the US government debate their responsibilities to refugees during a crisis for European Jews? Once Europe went to war in 1939, how did Americans debate their responsibility whether to enter the war or stay out of the war? And then once Americans learned about what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question, how did we debate our responsibility to the victims? Those are questions. How do we debate what we do about a crumbling democracy? Or how do we respond to a refugee crisis? Should we enter a war or shouldn't we enter a war? What's our responsibility to people targeted in a genocide? Those are resonant questions since 1945, and they remain resonant today, but we wanted to bring a historical perspective to that. Two things that we were really interested in promoting difficult questions about were these two gaps. We thought of these as gaps. There's a gap in this history, and I think this would have been true for citizens of London as well. There is a lot of information coming out of Germany and points east about persecution of Jews during the 1930s and 40s. But there's a gap between information and full understanding. I think understanding of historical events come with hindsight. So how do you take people back to this time in the 1930s and 40s and ask them to empathize with an international community without apologizing for inaction? That gap between information and understanding always weighed heavily on our team as we thought about putting together the exhibition. And then the second gap is an even more troubling one. And that's the gap between disapproval and a will to action on behalf of victims. And I think we see that over and over again in our histories as well. If you take one snapshot in time in the United States, 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, in November of 1938, the Gallup organization, which was the largest public polling organization in the United States at the time, asked Americans whether they approved or disapproved of the Nazis' treatment of Jews in Germany. And it won't surprise you, 94% of Americans said, we disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany. And so then in the same poll, they were asked in that public opinion poll, should we open our doors to Jewish refugees? And 72% of Americans said no. And 21% said yes. And that gap between disapproval of and will to action is also something that unfortunately we've seen really consistently in Americans' responses to genocide since the Holocaust as well. So that gives you just a framework for the exhibition. I wanted to talk briefly then also a little bit more broadly about memorial culture in the United States. And again, here I hope I can learn from you as you hear some of the things that I talk about in the United States. I'd be really interested in talking about comparisons and contrasts after that. The Holocaust Museum opened in 1993 in Washington, and when it opened, it was a different kind of institution than other American museums. It very consciously calls itself a memorial museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum. It wants to be both a memorial and museum, and it opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., as Rebecca said. The mall before 1993 had been a place to celebrate American achievement in art, in technology, in science, in culture. This was a counter story about a crumbling of democracy and arguably a United States that was slow to respond. So they told a different story about the fragility of democracy. That was out of place on the mall 25 years ago, and it was out of place in the landscape of American museums 25 years ago. And I think it changed the game entirely for museums since. People did ask in 1993, why is there a Jewish museum on the National Mall, right? Jewish population of the United States is, I think, somewhere a little bit over 3%, right? So why was there a Jewish museum on the mall? And the Holocaust Museum had to continually say, it's not a Jewish museum. It's a museum about the fragility of democracy. That's a tension that's always been there. But similar museums then followed. Museums that call themselves memorial museums. Whether you're talking about the September 11th Memorial and Museum in Lower Manhattan, or the Oklahoma City Memorial and Museum that was a response to the bombing of the federal building there. Other museums have also opened on the mall that look at very difficult history in the United States. The National Museum of the American Indian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture that just opened just a few years ago. So one of the things that interests me about this is we're speeding up the time between the end of an event and the opening of a museum to that event. One of the books that I teach to graduate students at Northwestern has the subtitle, "The Global Rush to Commemorate Atrocities." And I do think we've gotten into much more of a rush. The Holocaust Museum, for example, opened 38 years after the end of World War II. The 9/11 Museum opened in 2014, 13 years after 9/11. We've had less perspective on the historical event. There's a very important counterexample that I want to point out in the United States. One of the most interesting museums that's opened in the United States recently is called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. It commemorates and memorializes the histories of lynching and racial violence in the United States. And that didn't open until 2018. And there's a lot of reasons for that deal with politics and power in the United States. But I'm already seeing articles, I don't know if you're seeing these kind of articles, I'm already seeing articles in the United States press about what kind of memorial we're going to build to this pandemic. I would like to squash the pandemic rather than starting to design a museum to the pandemic, but it speaks to this global rush to commemorate atrocities right now. Most of these museums present history in a much more complex way than had been presented before 1993, even though they have relatively simple takeaway messages that they want to teach, especially students. The takeaway message of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, for example, is democracy is fragile. The takeaway of the National Museum for the American Indian, which is a neighboring museum on the mall, is that indigenous people are still here, living in the United States, and that they contribute to American culture. I think the takeaway for the National Museum for African American History and Culture is that Black culture is American culture, not separate from American culture. So these are different kind of messages than you would have seen prior to 1993. And I think, so in that way, the Holocaust Museum has been somewhat transformative. Let me just close by talking about then the contemporary political moment, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions about this. As I'm sure you know, there's been a great ongoing reckoning in the United States over the past 9 months or so regarding police violence against African Americans. We have a long way to go as a nation, but the conversation has changed palpably in the last 9 months, I think. And the influence on museums and on sites of culture has been profound. Just in Chicago, for example, 2 statues of Christopher Columbus were recently taken down at the order of our mayor. There were demonstrations at these 2 statues that sometimes turned violent. There was a pretty significant pressure campaign to remove the statues, and a less vigorous push by Italian American communities in Chicago who wanted to keep them up because of their pride in Christopher Columbus. So that their removal now shows obviously how slow how notions of how and whether to memorialize have changed significantly. And I haven't followed it closely, but I wish I had followed it more closely. The removal of the statue of Edward Colston, for example, in Bristol, I'd be interested to hear from you on that. So for me, as an academic and as an American citizen, I'm fascinated really by how memorials and museums and public statues become our proxy sites for the contested politics that we live with right now. That's not a new phenomenon, but I can't remember any time in my life where the conflicts have been this heated about statues, about memorials, about symbols, like the Confederate flag being taken into the US Capitol just 2 weeks ago. The Confederate flag was never taken into the US Capitol during our Civil War in the 1860s, but it was taken into the Capitol 2 weeks ago. So if I wanted to close with something positive, I would say that these heated debates, maybe they give the lie to the idea that Americans don't care about history. Clearly, we care deeply about history. But I think, unfortunately, it's very difficult in this contemporary moment in the public square to have reasoned debates that are based on shared understanding of the facts and shared understanding of what's true. And that's frightening. And it's particularly frightening when you think about commemorating the history of the Holocaust, when you have national leaders that decide that facts don't matter. Or when that lies are repeated frequently enough that they become believed. I mean, that is a technique taken right out of the Nazi propaganda playbook, to repeat a lie over and over again until it becomes believed. I hope we've turned a corner in the United States, but it still remains a really a troubling time, as I know it does there as well. So I'll close there, and hopefully we'll have left enough time for questions.
Wonderful. And actually, you did right what Elie Wiesel identified in the museum. You definitely have given us more questions than answers. So I am absolutely sure I've already had one question, but I'm just going to kick off. I'm going to abuse my power, asking you just 2 questions to start. And then, of course, I invite you all. I noticed on the website of the museum's website, there was a lot of detail about what happened in the Capitol on the 6th of January and the flags that were taken there. And the museum website even started to explain and create links between Nazi propaganda. And so I suppose my question is, how does the museum see itself responsible to speak to that in its surely non-partisan position it holds? And I guess connected to that would be that the museum was inaugurated in 93. So Rwanda happened a year later, Bosnia 2 years later, Darfur 10 years later. In what way did the museum see itself as responsible for responding to that? So two-part question, and then I promise you, my friends, you will be able to have a go.
So this is very complicated at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, particularly because it is a part of the federal government. It's funded in part by it's a public-private partnership, but it is so half of the employees are federal employees. About half the money comes from the federal government. So the strict line at the museum is you can't advocate from within the federal government. Now that is the line, but education is a form of advocacy, right? Choosing an exhibition topic is a form of advocacy. And so on your second question, the museum has evolved a great deal over 25 years. There have been exhibitions about Cambodia. There was an exhibition about Syria in 2018. I don't think that would have happened in the 1990s. And this speaks to a larger debate about understanding and memorializing the Holocaust, which is the shorthand for it is the uniqueness versus universal question, right? Is the Holocaust a unique historical event, or is it a universal historical event that should be understood alongside other genocides? There's a lot of confusion in this. I mean, Elie Wiesel actually wrote at one point, "The Holocaust is unique in its universalism." I've never been able to understand that sentence, as I've read it many, many times, but it speaks to that confusion. And I do think, but I think over time, we've seen a willingness of the museum in Washington to do education and advocacy and exhibitions about other genocides. It is very clearly not going to become a genocide museum. It is the core will be as a Holocaust museum. On the contemporary political debates and the education that's done around the violence at the Capitol, that was even more complicated in the last 4 years because it's part of the federal government, and Donald Trump was the head of the executive branch of the federal government. So the museum had taken a very strong position after the marches in Charlottesville, that they reiterated, I think, in their actions after January 6th, which was to educate people about the resuscitation of Nazi symbols in the United States among the far right and the danger of the resuscitation of those symbols without an understanding of that history. And I'll tell you, that is a vibrant, heated debate among the staff of whether the museum is going far enough or not going far enough. But that line between advocating a political position versus maintaining an integrity as an educational institution leads to a lot of internal debate at the museum about what is going far enough. I think the debates are handled respectfully, and I think that tension actually signals a healthy institution. But there's always going to be people who want the museum to go much further in terms of advocacy, and it's very reluctant to do that.
Yeah, I can well understand that. I was, it was really intriguing seeing that up on the homepage.
Yeah, I have to say there were symbols that I saw at that rally on January 6th that I had never seen before either. I mean, and some of these things are changing very quickly. The Holocaust Museum put some explanation of those symbols up. A feature that I can plug my brother's work now. The CNN put up a very useful guide to all these symbols as well, but it's many of them were new to me, even as I've been studying this for years. So it shows how fast this landscape of organizations is changing in the United States.
Yeah. I am going to let John Rubenstein, who has been waiting to ask a question, and then I have a couple in the chat. Bearing in mind our time, I might just read the ones in the chat. But John, you first.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
Daniel, I want to ask you on your take about an article that appeared today in The Guardian. And it's headed Imperial War Museum's Gallery to Question Way Holocaust Understood. I'll just read a couple of sentences from it.
Okay.
A new Imperial War Gallery, which by the way, they estimate will cost £30 million, will challenge visitors to, quote, beware the Holocaust.
Oh no, he just froze for me.
Yes, he froze for me too.
Oh no.
It was sounding interesting.
I know, I got the
So because John and Josie have frozen, I'm going to just give them a minute to come back and ask two questions that are quite similar. Vika asked the question, in view of rising anti-Semitism worldwide, can we talk of the failure of Holocaust education?
That's a very good and difficult question. I don't know that I want to accept that premise that we can talk about the failure of Holocaust education. One of the reasons I think is very personal to me, having worked in Holocaust education now for for 20 years, I've had the good fortune to get to know many Holocaust survivors well. And I feel that's been a great privilege, but I feel obviously we're at the moments where we are quickly losing living witnesses to this history, whether they're veterans or Holocaust survivors. And my children won't know Holocaust survivors or World War II veterans in the way that I do. And I feel it's part of my obligation to try to pass that on. And so that, I guess what I'm saying is I feel a duty to those people. And I think many people who work in Holocaust education do. And I wouldn't want to speak about the failure of Holocaust education in a way that insulted something that was so important to them. That said, I think we see this in Germany more than anywhere else, a concept of Holocaust fatigue. That we talk about. I am open to the premise that we may talk about the Holocaust too much. I think within Jewish communities, especially among ourselves as Jews, I think it can be troubling to define a Jewish identity around Holocaust commemoration rather than around something that's less narrow, right, and more full about whether it's Jewish text, Jewish culture, a living Jewish culture, rather than Jews as victims. And then I think one of the things that we see nationally in the United States, we see it in Germany and elsewhere, is an idea that talking about Jewish tragedies crowds out space for talking about other human rights violations. Yeah. I think that's changing. I really do think that's changing, but Holocaust museums will have to figure out how to adapt to that change.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump in. So Mash asked, and I know you'll be able to answer this very swiftly because of the footfall in the museum, of how does Holocaust education, or how can Holocaust education have an impact on interfaith relations in the world that is so divided? Are you finding that very successful at the museum? Or
I think it can. I think the museum in Washington really does not try to tell this as a Jewish story. Now, there are Holocaust memorials and museums throughout the United States. There's one, right here in a suburb of Chicago in Skokie, Illinois, that tells a much more Jewish-focused story on survivor experiences. The Holocaust Museum in Washington really does try to focus on the fragility of democracy and the role of non-Jews as whether as rescuers or as upstanders in this history, so that the shorthand that we use frequently in the museum is people have to be able to see themselves in this history, and 90% of the people who visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington are not Jewish. Yeah. And there are efforts within the educational centers there, whether it's interfaith outreach or other efforts to really try to diversify the audience of this history.
Okay, thank you. So I have another couple, and I see John's back, so we'll go back to you, John, in a sec. That Ezekiel asked about fake news, malicious actors in the digital world. How prepared are educators to really put a lot of effort into responding to the spread of disinformation as part of Holocaust education?
I think they have a long way to go. One of the things that's become so apparent over the past few years in the United States is I don't think a lot of the ideas that people brought to the Capitol, for example, were new. Anti-Semitism is always there in US history, and I think in human history. But the internet allows people to connect and in ways in much more easily, I think, to find each other in these sub communities much more easily. And people who study white supremacy in the United States especially talk about this philosophy of leaderless resistance right now. that the groups on you didn't see individual leaders in those capital groups, and that's by design. The internet allows for this leaderless resistance of people who have false information and prejudiced ideas against Jews or others to band together without leaders. In a way, the internet is their leader. They find their coherence that way. And that, I think, has changed really significantly, even, say, from neo-Nazism in the United States in the 1970s, when Nazis tried to march in a suburb of Chicago. There was a leader of the American Nazi Party at that point. Now you have all these sub-faction groups who want to be leaderless but act together, and that's frightening. And I don't know that Holocaust museums are that prepared to face that, because the history that they are commemorating, of course, also had a nation enthralled to a leader, right? Part of the essence of fascism is the leader is the party and the party is the state. And the kind of neo-Nazism that we see now and white supremacy that we see now in the United States, I think is very, very different. I think leaders matter less. And so Holocaust education is going to have to figure that out.
So yeah, that's interesting. John, I'm going to let you come back in, and then Sarah asked a really interesting question, Danny, for your thoughts on our situation here. So,
okay.
So I will come back to that.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Going back to that article.
Yes.
The Imperial War Museum's gallery to question the Holocaust understood, how the way Holocaust understood, and I'm interested in your take. So just a couple of sentences. Mm-hmm. A new Imperial War Museum gallery will challenge visitors to, quote, beware the Holocaust because you could have been a perpetrator. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on to say, taking a robust view of perpetrators, it will say, quote, the men and women who did this weren't unaware of what they were doing. And said lead historian on the project, James Bulgin. And just one more sentence, quote, in many other respects, they were relatively normal. They had kids, social lives, did the things we all do, and they also killed people. It wasn't the machine that killed people, which is what Holocaust galleries and representations have tended to suggest.
Right. I think that's a reflection of where Holocaust scholarship is right now, in terms of it becomes easier to distance yourself from this history if you say the Nazis were monsters and they were nothing like us. The more difficult question is to realize that these were people with families and children who, many of them who believed that they were acting in the national interests with their murderous project. And this goes back, a sea change in Holocaust scholarship, at least in the United States, came when a historian who teaches at the University of North Carolina named Christopher Browning wrote a book called Ordinary Men. And it was about one of the Einsatzgruppen troops. These are these mobile killing squads that went, as probably many of you know, that before death camps opened, historians talk about an era of the Holocaust by bullets, where these mobile killing units marched into Russia, went to where the Jews were, and murdered them there, not in gas chambers, but through mass shootings. The Nazis, if you'll excuse the phrase, learned over time that it was more efficient to build centers of death camps and move the Jews there to kill them rather than to go out. And what Browning found in studying the men who were part of these battalions is right what you see in his title, that they were ordinary. They were ordinary Germans. And that, I think, can be then a warning about the danger of subsequent genocides. And of course, we've seen many subsequent genocides since the Holocaust. So I'm not a fan of the phrase "never again" that gets used so often in Holocaust education, because we've seen this again and again and again. I do think we need to face the reality that these were ordinary, people. You said something at the beginning, though, about you could have been a perpetrator. And that, I think Holocaust museums in the United States have been very reluctant to make that leap. So that will be interesting to see how the Imperial War Museum does this. In Holocaust education, this is now becoming a little old-fashioned, but we would think about 3 communities that people could identify with when they come into a museum: victim, perpetrator, or bystander. And most museums tried very hard to have people identify with the bystanders in order to get them to understand that their actions mattered in the world. The educational philosophy was that it would be very hard for most people, non-Jews especially, to identify with the victims, and that it might not be the best educational mode to try to ask people to walk into a space like this and imagine themselves as a victim, and that it was a bridge too far to imagine yourself as a perpetrator. So I didn't know about this project at the Imperial War Museum, but it sounds like that could be a real sea change, asking people to identify with the perpetrator, or at least to imagine themselves as perpetrators. The other thing that just popped to mind when you said that is that most of these Holocaust museums, certainly the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, was founded well before the rise of social media, where everyone is the star of their own story all the time. And I think young people now going into museums do expect to be the central figure in every story, just as they are in their own social media feed. And I think museums will change significantly because of that as well. And I feel like in that I'm getting old, because I feel like that might not be for the better.
Okay. I am going to I think I'm going to go to Sarah's question, because you were talking about how the US might not make that leap. Sarah asked the question that whether you have any thoughts on why we have been slower to have a clearer national centre. So we do have Beit Shalom in Nottingham. We do have the galleries at the Imperial War Museum. And there has, as Sarah asked, there was a proposed Holocaust Memorial, an education centre in the garden next to Parliament, which has consequently been paused. In fact, I think there was someone who came to Westminster Synagogue, which is near there where I was last, who wrote to me a few years ago saying, this is where we residents walk our dogs. Would you consider supporting our trying to block it? Which was a fascinating email to receive, as you can imagine. So I think we would just like, as swiftly as you can, because I have one more question for you. Do you have a sense of why the states put themselves behind it? I mean, we might all have an inclination, and why it's been slower here.
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm on solid footing talking about why it has been slower there. I'd be interested to hear why you all think that it is. Politics is at the center of this. Politics is always at the center of commemoration. The Confederate statues that we are tearing down now throughout the United States didn't go up after the Civil War. They went up in the 19-teens as Civil War veterans were dying and as the second Ku Klux Klan was rising in the United States. Those statues are not about the Civil War. They're about America during the 19-teens. So what's happening in the late 1970s is a lot of criticism of Jimmy Carter's administration's policy on Israel, criticism of selling weapons and planes to Saudi Arabia. And the cynical take is the agreement to put a Holocaust museum on the Mall is a balancing for American Jewish communities, and that American Jewish communities had a particular power at that point in the United States, or a particular influence, I should say, and that's what they were asking for. And the Carter administration was trying to be seen in a better light. Now, maybe there haven't been moments like that. That's a very cynical read. That's not the only reason, but politics really do matter. And there are internal documents, if you look at Jimmy Carter's presidential papers, about the fact that these AWAC planes had been sold to Saudi Arabia, and that there was a concern about Jewish support for that president in the United States at that time. So it's not the only story, but it has to be told as part of the story. And maybe there haven't been equivalents in Britain. I don't know.
I think it's really important for us to watch and observe. And after I ask Danny his last question, if we have time, it'll be interesting to hear what we think, or maybe this will be a conversation for all of us. So the last question is from Paul Richmond. Whether you have a view on what America, or indeed Britain, could have done when they knew so much of what was happening in Europe. So, for instance, Britain did discuss bombing in 1944.
Yeah. Right. So the tragedy of this history is that when the United States could have done the most, it knew the least. And what I mean is, we didn't know that there would be mass murder of Jews during the 1930s. The Nazis didn't know. What they call the final solution really begins in 1941. The United States could have opened our doors to immigrants and refugees. We had restrictive immigration policies in the 1930s that allowed a very restricted number of visas to be granted, but we came nowhere close to even granting the number of visas that could have been allowed. So it's a low number, and then we come nowhere close to. So for example, the United States in the 1930s could have let in, under our restrictive quota system, about 25,000 immigrants every year who were German born. In 1933, we let in 1,000. In 1934, we let in 3,000. If you add up all of the unused visas that could have been used, even under this xenophobic system, it's about 200,000 more immigrants. So that doesn't stop the Holocaust, but that's 200,000 lives. And why didn't we? All those concerns that I talked about: national security concerns, anti-Semitism, an economy that was, suffering through a Great Depression. And then by the time war comes and we go to war in late 1941, it's too late for civilians to be crossing the Atlantic. So that's the tragedy, is by the time that we learn about mass murder, that option of letting in Jewish refugees is closed. Now, we could have pressured other countries much more than we did. The last Jewish community to be deported to Auschwitz is the Hungarian Jewish community in the summer of 1944. The international community in Britain, in the United States, knew exactly what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. And there's some pressure on Hungary, but not enough. So we could have used political means as well during the war that we didn't use. The way we explain this I'll close with the way we explain this in the exhibition is the Nazis fought two wars. The Nazis fought a war against the Allies, and they fought a war to destroy the Jews of Europe. And the United States, in response, fought one war. We fought a war to defeat fascism. We did not fight a war to rescue Jews. Mm-hmm. It's never a war to rescue Jews. Even at the end, even when the War Department here is saying, let's bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz so the Hungarian community can't be deported, the response to that within Roosevelt's administration is, that's not a war aim. And that's not a lie for them. Their war aim was defeat fascism. Their war aim was not rescue Jews. And so the wars don't match up, the wars that the Nazis are fighting and the wars that the Allies are fighting.
Yeah, that's very fair. That's very fair. We have come to the end of the time that we've allotted ourselves, and I think I'm not alone in feeling that we could continue this conversation. You have presented so beautifully to us by really lighting that fire of conversation of how we do remember, and the responsibility taken, as we wanted to hear about, by the US and their museum. If it's any consolation to everyone, I don't know, I have a 13-year-old who did Holocaust Memorial Day at his state school today. So I feel somewhat optimistic that there is a commitment, but I wonder whether the rise of anti-Semitism or xenophobic hatred of others is is a conversation that we might want to look at that maybe is not affected by this. I'm going to ask you, invite you to get a candle, if you indeed are going to light your candle, so we can thank Danny and offer the Holocaust Memorial Day prayer for us as a community together. I think, Danny, you really captured for us that there is a distinction for us, even as a Jewish community, of how we mark Holocaust Memorial Day and Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah being that added day into the Jewish calendar, and we seem to engage with it very differently. And historically, for the 10 years that I've been with this community, I've really noticed that Holocaust Memorial Day seems to attract more of us. And I feel there's a whole thesis in that of why maybe understanding the way that Elie Wiesel talked about unique in its universalism maybe allows us to feel that we are also looking at these other atrocities. Danny, you've been stupendous. And as you said, it is the benefit of these extraordinary days that the world feels smaller, that it is possible. In fact, I think when I first told someone you were coming, they said, really? He's flying over? I said, no, he doesn't have to. He can
I wish.
from his own office. So I'm sure you wish, and I'm sure the Green family here do also.
Yeah.
So if you are lighting, I do want to invite you, encourage you to get that candle out. Perhaps you've chosen to have 6 plus 1. Perhaps you've chosen to have the candles for the genocides that the day tries to commemorate, of Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, and Darfur. But however you want to do it, the lighting a candle in the darkness is the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day. And I think we really have done that. I really feel something different happened tonight with the way Danny spoke to us and used his immense, fluent, just superb knowledge, but in such an accessible, engaging way that that actually we are interested. He was not preaching to the converted. Many of us have a very far reach of people that we have conversations with. This is not a cozy crowd of regulars. There have been 46 computers at various times during this hour, and I really thank you enormously, Danny. I'm going to share the prayer that was written for Holocaust Memorial Day this year. Loving God, we come to you with heavy hearts, remembering the 6 million Jewish souls murdered during the Holocaust. In the horrors of that history, when so many groups were targeted because of their identity, and in genocides which followed, we recognize destructive prejudices that drive people apart. Forgive us when we give space to fear, negativity, and hatred of others simply because they are different from us. In the light of God, we see everyone as equally precious manifestations of the divine and can know the courage to face the darkness. Through our prayers and actions, help us to stand together with those who are suffering still, so that light may banish all darkness. Love will prevail over hate, and good will triumph over evil. And let us say, all of us, Amen. This prayer for this day was written by Ephraim Mervis, Chief Rabbi, Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, Senior Imam, Kari Asim. The three of them came together to write this prayer. And although I often seek prayers written by liberal colleagues and us liberal rabbis, it really felt an important one for us to have today. So I thank you so much for joining us, everyone else. There is no doubt that a good turnout adds to the specialness of the evening. So Daniel, take a moment to look at some of the thanks to you, and I thank everyone else for being here. Thank you, Richard, for your brother.
Thanks, Rebecca. I can't wait to be able to see you all again in London. It'd be great to be able to travel again. So hopefully one day soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. So I need to stop live stream right now. I can see people are clapping and saying thank you to you. So we're stopping live stream. Thanks to all those